In the last year, I realized I have tried 10 different GM styles and tables. About 50% were paid, 50% were free. A lot of those paid games I left after 2 or 3 sessions. And throughout this entire time, I found 2 things. Few paid games are actually worth the money. A lot of the reasons that I left games all kind of centered around one major flaw. I'm KYLIE. I like to talk about my struggles in the TTRPG world, I guess. And today I want to talk about that major flaw. Well, there's a kind of a couple, but they kind of all are under one umbrella so that both you and I can be a better GM, because we want to keep players engaged and wanting to come back to the table. Before we dive into what I feel like is that major flaw, I want to just say, if you take away nothing else from this video, please take this away. You can DM a game right now. There are people out there who consider themselves experienced DMs, and they are providing what I feel like are beginner level games and getting paid for it. If they can get paid for a beginner style game, you can DM. That's it. There's no other caveats. I do also want to just say I have only stuck with one paid game the entire year. And in general, I did try to stay in a campaign for about 3 sessions. There is one I definitely left after 2. I tended to try to give it at least 3 sessions. One, that gives me a better opportunity to figure out the player dynamic and the GM style, but also, especially for paid games, they typically on Start Playing give the first one for free. And to me, I want to stay at least a couple times to pay for my seat, because I did take up a seat at that table and not just bounce immediately. So there's that. So I typically did stay in a game for about 3 sessions. Of all the games, paid and non, the major flaw that all of them had was a lack of story, right? And what the heck does that mean? Right. So to me, this means your game is predictable. A good story has twists and turns, makes you think a lot. There's a surprise, there's dips, there's peaks. It's not stagnant, right? There's a reason we go over that whole plot graph in English class, because that's what drives a compelling story. And the biggest issue I have found is that GMs get too comfortable. They know that they have players on the spectrum who love a little bit of everything, you know? They have players who just like roleplay, players who just like the storytelling, players who just want the mechanical combat aspects. And so what these GMs end up doing is they end up creating a formula that meets all of those 3 expectations, those 3 pillars, if you would, of D&D. And in general, this formula is not bad. Formulas in general aren't necessarily bad. It can speed up your session prep time, and it can really help you make sure you're providing all the different aspects to your players. What makes it bad is when they follow it every single time. Now, if it's a one-shot, yes, put it all together like that, perfect. But if you're talking about a full-fledged campaign, you have the time to spread that out. There are obviously merits to a good formula. There's nothing wrong with having a standard amount of RP, a standard amount of combat, a standard amount of storytelling and plot diversity. We've seen other types of formulas work, like 5-room dungeons. But if that formula is happening every single game is gonna be stale, because players will know exactly what to predict, and it just gets boring. And I have a couple of real world examples, one not tabletop related and one tabletop related. Recently, of course, I have just gotten through the first trimester of a second pregnancy. And in that first trimester, I had a lot of morning sickness. And that meant I literally could only eat toast for every single meal. Toast in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. I like toast, or I did. Now I think I don't want to have toast again for at least another 3 years. It's boring, it's bland. You can spice it up. You can add a little jam. You can if you have morning sickness, because literally you can't. it just doesn't work that way for morning sickness. But anyway, you could spice it up a little bit, but it's still toast, right? And if you have toast for every single meal, eventually you're just gonna start hating mealtime. That can happen with D&D. If it's the same thing every time, eventually you're just gonna start equating those negative feelings with the game itself and not the meal. Man, this analogy is running away. My second real world example is actually from the early days of GMing for me. This was my first campaign, and I remember this very vividly. I actually surprised two, what I considered at the time, still consider, veteran players at my table when I had 2 combats in one session. They, of course, were, they were shocked. They just shrugged it off and they said, oh yeah, it's a different GM. And at the time, this did not register to me because I didn't know anything. But it stuck around with me because I had surprised what I felt were 2 veteran players by putting 2 combats in something. And it did kind of make things rough for them because they ended up having spent all of their spell slots, their abilities in that first combat, making the second combat a lot more difficult, which made them more engaged, for sure. So how do we fix stale storytelling, right? How do we get rid of this stale environment that we're creating? Well, to do that, I want to actually examine some examples of good games that I have been in this year. Most of the examples that I consider good came from free games, and all of them are from my West Marches server, which is not to give a shameless plug. There is a little bit of a shameless plug. They were just really interesting games that I was in the last year that I feel like I actually think the GMs in my West Marches are doing things right. So I want to talk about it. So this first session for story time here only had 3 very, very, very small combats. I think 2 of them, only about 30 minutes. The stakes were high in those combats, but it wasn't a combat heavy session. But here's the premise. This mission was to dive into the sewers after our epic multi-table event, which I talk about in this other video, just to see what these rattling creatures were up to. You see, during our epic event, every table saw rattlings who, once the Aurora Sphere, that's the dome that keeps monsters out of the city, once the magical Aurora Sphere fell down, the rattlings disengaged and rushed into the sewers. And so our job was to figure out what they were after while they were down there. In this adventure, the GM did several things right, in my eyes, that really made for a very compelling story, okay? The first thing that I noticed almost immediately is that he allowed his map to tell a story. I think he made his own map. Obviously, we were using Foundry because this is an online game, and so we use maps a lot. He put specific things on the map that showed the progression of rattling civilization. Yeah, you heard that right. Rattling civilization. With these small clues, like a doll left behind, there was a scattering of notebooks and paper. There was a slow increase in quality in both the tools, the building materials on each floor as we dove deeper. With all of these things, he told a story without actually telling us, hey, the rattlings were progressing in technology. He let the environment tell that story for him. All he managed to do was describe anything that we found or investigated, the results of our rolls, and he allowed us as players to converse and put things together in our own way. Even the combats served a specific purpose. Like that first combat we had on the upper levels, we later found out that was a creature released from the lower levels from a lab. What this GM did correctly is that he dropped clues, multiple clues, throughout the map and allowed us to put things together. Wendy, can you stop scratching on things? This is something I don't feel like a lot of GMs do. GMs have a hard time at hinting at things instead of just flat out telling what's going on. And I totally get it, because there's sometimes it's just hard to describe something in the moment. There are times where you're just super excited and you want to spill the beans. That happens a lot to me. But there's also a handful of DMs that I ran into that only offer one opportunity to figure out that clue. So if the players miss that, they feel obligated to tell them later. I think GMs are also afraid of players misinterpreting the clues, which I think you shouldn't be afraid of, because also sometimes they can come up with ideas that are better than yours to begin with. What this GM did to combat this was that he had multiple versions of the same clue, essentially. For instance, he used forks and small tools throughout everything. So on the first levels, it was clearly stolen forks and tools. And as we got deeper, it went to like crudely made versions of those tools, and then like well-made versions of those tools. But if we had missed those tools and those forks and utensils, there was also books. On the first floor, there was a book that had very crude drawings, no writing. And as we progressed all the way down to the bottom floor, the bottom one had complex blueprints. So those both of those clues give the same hints, right? But there are two different ways of finding it. So if one of us rolled poorly on the investigation on this one, we have another chance. Another point I want to add here is that he was very good at drawing out that tension and giving space for each of those clues to settle in. You want tension, by the way. Tension helps with story. Tension makes people engaged. You want players to wonder what the heck is going on and try to figure out what's going on. He did a great job of doing this throughout the session by staggering those clues out, by allowing players the space to just explore the map without interruption from combat and things like that. But he actually started dropping these clues and this tension before the game even started with the epic, where every table saw ratlings diving into the sewers at some point or another. That hinted to us that they were looking for something, since they ignored combat completely. So this tension builds and builds and builds, and then by the time we got to the bottom and we're making our conclusions, it was such a release of that tension that we were super excited and we wanted to go find out what the ratlings took from here, because they obviously took some pretty valuable things from the lower floors. I would like to also mention that not every session that he has run is exactly like this one. He has a style, of course. All GMs, whether you realize it or not, you have a style of play, but he has run his games differently. Like there was one where the stakes and tension were high because of the very large enemy count and the tight passageways. That was it. There weren't a lot of clues. He did have some clues in that one too, but like that wasn't like the main tension driving force. It was the amount of enemies that we had to kill to get through this area. And he's also had other sessions where he's had crazy house monsters and things that like really could kill us at any given moment. And those are also high stakes combat, but it's all a little bit different. Meaning when you sit down at his table, you don't know what to expect necessarily. You get a sense for how he runs the game, how he describes things, how he gives players the room and agency to run pretty much rampant. When you sit down at the table for one of his sessions, you don't know what's going to happen. It is unpredictable. And that's what you want. You want players to be engaged from the get-go, wondering what the heck is going on. I will say that I, as a GM, definitely struggle with this. I try. Of course, my biggest homebrew world is Remnant. That's what we play on the West Marches server in the Discord. You can join it. It's free, though the holidays are obviously coming up, so expect slightly fewer games just because GMs have families. So even with the West Marches, where you have almost essentially multiple one-shots, I do try to hint at a bigger evil going on in the campaign at each session. And whether or not my players put it together, some of them are catching on, but not all of them. It's a little harder with the West Marches, but I do think I'm trying. I definitely struggle with that tension building. And I think that is something I would definitely take away from this GM, is just how he gives the space to let players chat and come up with their own conclusions without really saying anything. Another flaw that comes from that formulaic DM style where you are just doing the same thing over and over is that combat becomes too regular, too predictable. Well, if there's one combat every session and then you long rest, there's no stakes there, right? You know you can blow everything off in this one session, probably survive, and then be at full health, full spell slots by the time you join the next session. I also found that DMs that kind of follow this structure tend to just balance the encounter, find a general map, and just plop everything on there and go. Sometimes that's great, but not utilizing the environment or the mechanics built around that does make things a little bit more stale in my eyes. It becomes just another go in, clear the enemies, and then next session do the same thing over and over again. So let's talk about another example that's kind of the opposite of this. Again, a free game that I was in on the server. This GM, he also had a lot of environmental storytelling like the previous GM, but he is also pretty good at making combat a little bit more interesting with the environment. And there's a particular battle that I remember that I really, really enjoyed. For this particular story, the mission was to hunt a group of goblins that had essentially waylaid a shipment of goods to Honor's Reach food, which is very important in our campaign. To start, of course, he had a typical overturned wagon with goblin tracks on the ground and, you know, a few survivors who could tell the story, some of which were in dire straits. So he offered that role-playing aspect with talking to the survivors, and he let the environment tell the story itself. When we arrived there, we could see, oh, goblins definitely waylaid the shipment here, but we're missing a wagon, without him telling us anything, just by showing off the map. So the environment told the story, and I think this is a very basic way to do that, right? I think this is a situation that probably comes up a lot in D&D games where a shipment or a wagon or, you know, civilians are waylaid while traveling, and I think this is a situation that has happened a lot. But of course, he takes this a step further, okay, which is what we're gonna focus on. We track those goblins to a cave hideout. We're, of course, expecting the worst, but we realize that the goblins are newer occupants to this cave. And this is where he allows the environment to do the storytelling for him. While the newer occupants of this cavern were in fact goblins, the map and the environment said something completely different. First, it was just old skeletal remains. Then it was a strange, rotten storage space, hidden alcoves. It just kept progressing. And then we found a small hut inside this cave with a mushroom farm, or I think it was a mushroom farm. Some sort of bandit hideout at one point in time. This is where I think the map making was pretty key. I'm pretty sure he made the maps himself, and you could tell he put a lot of thought into what was put on the map. This is also why I love finding maps, but this is also why I end up making a lot of my own maps, because I like to put those small details in. As we got to that hut, this is where the combat starts telling a story, because the hut was across what looked to be like a chasm. What looked to be a chasm with a little bit of water. There was a bridge, there was a ledge on the far side. You had essentially three options to get to the other side where the enemies were outside of this cabin. That made us be tactical. It made us try to consider our options. It made people who didn't usually shoot from afar shoot from afar. It made things more interesting. But I think the reason it was more interesting was also because the players now had to be the storytellers. Sure, the GM could go through and explain how people were shooting things and stuff, but because we had to be tactical, because we had to watch where we were stepping and had to move into specific places, us as players got to describe what we were doing more thoroughly, and it was a little bit easier for people who don't usually roleplay to do that, to be like, well, I can't go across the bridge, I'm gonna climb down into the cavern and rush across and climb back up. Yes, the GM is a storyteller, but you are not the only storyteller at the table, and you need to remember this. Your players can be storytellers too, if you give them the space and agency to do that. Setting up strange obstacles like this allowed us to be tactical, allowed us to think outside the box, have to think outside the box. We all started narrating cool moves and flanking maneuvers. after combat, when we got to the cabin, there was a lot more kind of explained as to what was going on here. I would call that a subplot, where, you know, we were learning about this bandit hideout and how it had been down here in this cave, because it really didn't have anything to do with the goblins, right? It was kind of just a world building element. A mistake I think I've seen GMs do is to not close out that subplot quickly. If you leave it open, then players are going to forget it even happened. They don't get a good, satisfying conclusion from that. Also, it can be turned into a main plot instead of the subplot. This was completely contained in this one adventure, a great little story about what had happened in this area a long time ago before adventures even were here. And it actually made that adventure memorable because, again, it's just goblins raiding farming supplies. How do you make that memorable without something? And that kind of did that for this GM. Just be careful that your subplots don't take away from your main story or mission, so be careful with these, but I think that this GM did a really good job with a very closed story within this space. This is also something I'm not great at. It's very easy to just get into the habit of, here's the encounter, here's a flat space, go. I am trying better. I do have like a whole video where I talk about combat and making it more interesting. That's because I needed those tips. And so I was looking up this kind of information. Like recently, I did have, literally they were entering plains. So literally it's flat, very few bushes, very few like hills, dips, things to hide behind. And what I did was I threw a very, very, very large horde of undead in front of them. Maybe they could have taken on if they were very lucky and they did a lot of AoE stuff or something, but really was not a great idea to take on. Also hinted at bigger story plot lines as well. But with these very large numbers, it forced my players to do something different, something creative. They did a pass without a trace. They tried to hunker behind a tree. They also had to roll stealth, and some of them, it could be iffy. So that did bring the stakes up as well. I hope this means they were more engaged, but you'd have to ask them. So what does any of this mean, right? In the scheme of things, how do you make a better, more compelling story that keeps people coming back? Here's what I've gathered so far from these examples. There are more examples I've had too of other ways to improve games from those 10 different GMs as well. But we're just talking about the story part, right? First one, of course, mix up the clues and provide those hints in multiple ways so that players definitely find it. Let them make inaccurate guesses. Let them think about things. Give them the actual chance to discover them. Try not to just spoil it. I know, sometimes it's exciting. If you can, try to spread out those clues if it's for a main plot over several sessions. Don't just drop it all at once. That'll also give your story cohesion throughout your campaign. Of course, if you're like me and you're running games in a West Marches on this server, this can be very hard. You're just jumping from game to game to game. You don't always have the same players, that kind of thing. One way a third GM on my server combats this is that he actually uses the role-playing channel. We have a whole role-playing channel on our Discord where you can chat in character. And he has actually used this to drop hints about plots and things happening that lead themselves to missions or sessions. It's actually really awesome to read through it. He's way better at that than I am. And I think it's also, you know, a very creative way of utilizing something on this server since we don't run a typical long-term campaign. Next, of course, is drawing out the tension. Let your players mull things over. Give each clue the space, the time needed to be comprehended. Let your players discuss. Don't correct them immediately. Let them get things wrong. I love doing that, honestly, because I like to prove them wrong sometimes. But also hinting at something over time, here and there, just tiny hints, also helps drag out that tension. Of course, another big thing we saw is letting the environment tell the story. Now, obviously, if you're not using maps on a virtual tabletop like our games, you can do this just by reading descriptions. You can write it out so that you know you have it. You can paraphrase it. This is, of course, what you would do in modules. This is what modules do, is they typically have box text that you read aloud. And a lot of times there are hints in there, which is why you need to pay attention when your DM is reading box text. Avoid following the same formula every time. Following a formula, if it helps you with session prep and stuff, perfectly fine, but mix it up sometimes. Plan a session with absolutely no combat. Plan a session with only combat. Try a hex crawl style. Try a 5-room dungeon style. Mixing up what you present at the table will keep your game fresh, keep your players engaged, and keep them coming back for more. But don't worry, you don't have to mix it up every time. But I promise, if you do it occasionally, they're gonna be like, whoa, what is going on? Which leads to this next point. Never be comfortable. I think as soon as we as GMs become comfortable at the table, that's when things get stale. I, of course, am an anxious GM, so comfortable is a relative term because I'm anxious about everything that I've prepared for the game. But this kind of goes beyond that, right? If you're feeling like you aren't being very creative, or like session prep isn't engaging to you, or if you feel like you can spit things out extremely quickly, you might be getting comfortable. Because I think it's very hard to come up with something brand new. Not that it has to be brand new, but to come up with something engaging every time, right? It takes a little bit of effort to do that. And of course, if you want more tips on making combat interesting, I did a whole video about that. Also, if you want to watch some of these West Marches games that I'm talking about, unfortunately, I don't record the other GM stuff, but you can watch my stuff. I record all of my games for Remnant, and you can watch any of them right now for free on Patreon. They are unedited. I literally just plop them on there, so have fun with that. And I will continue to post the unedited actual plays for free there. You do not have to subscribe to a tier, but if you do, of course, that helps me out a ton, and I appreciate you. But I will see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye. I think that was extremely long.